Welcome, dear educators, dear colleagues, for the 18th webinar hosted by your International Educational Hub, One Kwan Village. Today, we are honored to have with us today the internationally acclaimed education expert and workshop leader, Mr. Cormac Davey. Welcome, Cormac. Very honored to have you today with us.
Thanks very much, Sean. There's still people coming in there, so as they come in, we can let them in and welcome them. But it's a pleasure to connect with all of you today, and I'm looking forward to the next hour and a half, and maybe more. If we get good quality questions, we'll have a long discussion about something that's very close to my heart and something that I work with every day of my life with the PDST. And John will explain that in the next slide, what I do for a living, I think. Isn't that right, John?
Yes. Welcome, Cormac. Cormac is from County Kildare, Ireland, a teacher of history, politics and society, and religious education. Cormac has worked with the Professional Development Service for Teachers, PDST, with whom he promoted the improvement of teaching and learning in schools throughout Ireland. He has worked in his subject areas while also facilitating professional development in the areas of formative assessment and team teaching for the inclusion of students of all needs. Cormac has over 20 years experience of teaching in Ireland, China, and Italy. While in Italy, he worked as deputy head of St. Louis High School, Milan. He gained experience of EAL learning during his time in Shandong, China, having lectured student teachers at university level in the National University of Ireland, Galway. Cormac is a firm believer in the role of a teacher as one to facilitate student-centered learning. Cormac is currently engaged in research for a PhD in education. Welcome, Cormac. We're very well honored, as always, to have you with us. A great educator, an international educator who believes, like all of us, in the sacred mission of education and implements it daily. Welcome, Cormac. Honored to have you today.
Thanks very much, John, for that welcome. I'm not sure I'm worthy of such an honourable welcome. It's a pleasure to have worked with you over the last number of months, and Hakwan Village as well, and thanks to them for all their support. Look, for me, this is a huge opportunity to meet with educators from around the world to talk about formative assessment and its place in encouraging the 21st century lifelong learner to access learning within the classroom. Before we move on to the initial few slides, which are interactive slides, I'd like to just point out that your queries and your questions are very welcome. Feel free to put the questions into the chat as we go, and John will address them to me if needs be as we go through, or definitely at the end. What will also happen, and you'll see in a moment, is that I'm going to share a Padlet with you, which of course is a means of formative assessment. And in my job with the Professional Development Service for Teachers in Ireland on the national level, throughout all our webinars, we mirror methodologies that we can use in the classroom. So occasionally here, I will mirror what we should be doing in the modern 21st century classroom using digital tools. As there's a lot of me talking to you throughout this, of course, as well, in a classroom, we would try to change that to where it becomes student-centered, discursive, a dialogic setup, which allows formative assessment to become part of the environment. And the one lesson I'd ask you to take maybe, or the one learning from this, if nothing else, is that formative assessment is part of a suite of supports that we offer as educators to students in our care. Because the students that come into our schools at a very young age and leave at 18 and 19 to go to universities and go to work, it's our responsibility to make sure that throughout their learning experience, rather than calling it teaching and rather than calling us teachers, we call ourselves facilitators. We're facilitating their learning through teaching and learning experiences. So if you take that with you today and nothing else, I'd be incredibly happy. Anyway, if you use the QR code on the right, or you take that link and put it into the chat, and I'll move in and out of this slide deck because it might be handier just to talk to you, and we can have a communication. I'll display the Padlet to you. If you can't get into it, let me know, or let John know, and I'll put that address into the chat for you as well. But please scan the QR. I understand that in some of you may not be able to access it at the moment, and in that, just take the learning from it, that the use of a tool like Padlet is very good for formative assessment. And on the Padlet, I placed a document from our own national curriculum design group in Ireland for you to deal with success criteria and a key part of formative assessment. So I'm going to bring you there now. Pardon me for a moment. You get to see all my plans in the background. Okay, so using that code, it'll bring you to this Padlet, and on it there's an opportunity to share thoughts. If you haven't used Padlet before, you can click down here and add your opinions and thoughts. This is the document that I've shared with you. It's accessible on this Padlet now for you from now on. This is the group that designs curriculum here, but this is for teachers. It's on formative feedback, and I would hate you to think you spend an hour and a half in my company and go home then, or turn off your machine and have nothing to show for it in concrete, because I am a teacher, and I think as teachers, we like to get stuff. So this is a document that you can read through in your own time. And a lot of the work that I've done and a lot of the reading that I do starts with this at the very basis. So what I'll do is I'll go back, I'll show you the QR code again. That's the QR code. I'll take this for you and I'll put it into the chat. And everyone should be able to access it then through the link should be in there now for you.
Yeah, it's there. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And as I said, if you can't access it, you can't access it. There's no problem. But just take it that as a learning tool, the Padlet is very useful in terms of formative assessment. It allows you and your students to comment, to work on, to share. It's a sharing point as well for information as you go. A lot of us get our students to journal constantly. This is another way of doing it. As well, of course, it's a visual resource, which allows access to all learners. And that's incredibly important. John mentioned, oh, thank you very much. I see a comment there, the NCCA. John mentioned as well my time in China. With my experience of EAL, I've become very involved in team teaching for inclusion. And I just feel that to be an inclusive classroom, it's incredibly important that all learners can access. I'll move on because I'm conscious of time and I really do want to hear your questions. But please make use of the Padlet. And also the Padlet is a great place for you to share your thoughts today as you're going through it. Because remember, in the chat facility, when you leave the meeting, or if your Wi-Fi knocks off, as often happens in this world of 21st century online learning, you lose your place in the chat. So maybe the Padlet is the best place to share resources. So if you have something today that you want to share with us, please do, and it can build up our resources as a collaborative community. Now, our next interactive one, and this is key for me because this will show me where you are in your experience of formative assessment. So if you use the QR code on the right, and remember QR codes, there's plenty of websites that you can develop your own QR code using your URL, and they're a great way for students to access learning as well. So if you use the QR code on the right, or menti.com/ZM995B1XCZ, you can see the URL there. And the class code is 2380878. I'll leave that up for a moment in silence. And when you get to that, if it works, which hopefully it does, you should be asked a number of questions. You should be given a chance to suggest 3 questions.
Yeah, of course.
People are still joining us, so that's okay.
Yeah.
There's no problem there. That's great. The more people to join us, the better, John, I think.
Yes, yes.
So you'll be asked to give 3 words to describe formative assessment. Well, you know what? Whoever put in learning there has made me very comfortable. I was really worried that this wouldn't work, to be honest. That's always a fear when we're online.
It's working perfectly.
That's all right. Has anyone asked in the chat for the address to be put in, John? Are they okay?
Can you please post the link here too? You post the link, no? Already, yeah. You can post the link for, yeah, please. Yeah.
I'll do that.
They're asking for that, yeah.
I'll do that. QR codes can be there sometimes. There you go.
Okay.
No.
So we can start with the, I have a first question, Cormac. Yeah. My first question is going to be, when is an assessment considered a formative assessment? Moreover, you know, there's always this confusion within us as educators. I am doing a formative or summative. What are the main differences between a formative and the summative assessment?
What a great question. And thanks, John. And the next number of slides will deal with that. And in fact, it's interesting with the starting point that we come from here and how would you explain formative assessment, because that's linked directly to your question. For me, and there's a definite slide that answers this question, formative assessment is ongoing. It's the use of digital tools, it's the use of questioning. And I know we're keen to have real life examples today. It's the use of collaborative learning. It's the use of a differentiated classroom that revolves around a variety, and not all educational tool has to be digital as well, you know, in the same way as that not all needs for a child are academic, they may be social. So the main difference is that one is ongoing, one is creating learning throughout the teaching and learning experience, and we facilitate that, and summative is at the end, and it's an assessment of the learning we've done all through rather than the learning as we pass through the experience. That's reflected in what's on the word cloud and the screen at the moment, if ever you can see that. Ongoing assessment, informative, real life based. I like that, real life based, because that's what it is. Everything we do in life, even here, me talking to you this morning, feedback is important. And formative assessment is a collection of, you know, outlining learning intentions, outlining expected learning outcomes, looking at success criteria, looking at the various stages of learning as we go through the experience. Dylan Williams will talk in a video in a few moments, and he gives the example of, you know, getting on a plane and not knowing where you're going at the end of it. When you're 13 or 14 and you go into a classroom and nobody tells you what's expected of you and no one gives you affirmation as you go through it, if that happens, we're not doing our job. But ongoing assessment, evaluate, not graded. Yep, that's key. It doesn't have to be graded at all. Doesn't feel like an exam. Imagine that. Imagine living in a 21st century classroom and being educated and being comfortable and happy and not having the stress to feel that you've been examined all the time. Submitting feedback. So look, thanks very much for sharing on that. Again, I would emphasize to all of you that this is mirroring something that you can use in your classroom. You can use a Mentimeter to get feedback and to give formative assessment as you go through. And I think the best advice I can give, and I give to all teachers when I'm dealing with it, if you're not sure about Mentimeter or any of these, just keep playing with it, keep working with it, because it will perfect itself in the end. For all of you. Okay, just give me a moment and I will get the PowerPoint up and running again. Now, as I said to John when he asked this question, which was when is assessment considered formative assessment, and what are the main differences between formative and summative assessment, I alluded to the next number of slides and we'll move through them. I'm keener to get your involvement today rather than be slaves to slides. So keep asking the questions to John. It's a circular approach that begins with learning intentions and success criteria. And this is nothing new to you, all right? Nothing new to any of you. But what I would say to you, that this should become part of your normal everyday practice. It should be part of that suite of supports I mentioned. It should be part of differentiation, part of your classroom planning, part of collaborative learning. Effective use of questioning, higher and lower order questioning, allowing time. If we go back to the previous slide, I read out the code and I gave you time. I spoke to the inspectorate here. I think internationally there's a variety of inspectors. In Ireland, we have our own inspectors from the department, and in my job, I get to work with them, and they're not nearly as scary in real life when you meet them. Different when they walk into your classroom, of course. And they were just saying, you know, sometimes when we talk about think, pair, share, as teachers, we forget about the think part. We forget to give that moment to think. And there's a stat in one of the questions, you know, as teachers, we answer over 70% of the questions we ask, when we should just give time and allow their peers to help them. Effective formative feedback. It's not sufficient to say very good. So if I say to John, that's very good, John. John doesn't learn anything from that. John needs to be told what's good, what's not so good, and what needs to get better. And as in everything in life, we just need to be positive in our affirmation. Self-assessment and evaluation. Very difficult as educators even to be honest in our self-assessment, to take that helicopter view where we're reflective. And as we move through, you know, whether it's the IB or whether it's A-level or whatever system you're using internationally, we're always asking students now to be reflective, to take time to self-assess, to evaluate. Peer assessment and evaluation, as I said, this is part of the collaborative learning area, which should be in the center of any 21st century classroom. No disrespect to anyone here or to me or to John as educators. Doesn't matter how educated we are. The students in front of us will learn more from their peers. They will be more comfortable learning from their peers. And it's cyclical. You go back to learning intentions and success criteria and see if it's working. Students at the center, please take a moment, again, using that time to read the quote. And if you address particularly the last two lines, assessment can only lead to improvement in learning outcomes if students themselves take action and use assessment information to close gaps in their own learning. The problem with summative assessment, and it's part of our educational environment, and that's fine, there's no problem with that. We're not here to damn summative assessment at all. But the problem with it is it's at the end. And if that's the only assessment that's going on, it's too late. You look at a school year, if we wait until the half term or the midterm, as we say here in October, you could be 9-10 weeks into learning and we haven't offered any form of assessment or guidance if we're only using an exam at the end of it. And 10 weeks is a long time for a student to be struggling in a subject and the teacher not to know and the student not to know and the parent not to know. So as a very basic answer to your question, John, when is assessment, or what is the main differences? Assessment of learning happens after learning. It's information gathered by a teacher. It's transferred into marks, comparison with performance of others, and looks back on past learning. Nothing new there, we all know that. Whereas assessment for learning, or formative assessment, is an integral part of the learning process, that facilitated learning environment we're talking about. That information is shared with the learner. If we're involved in sport or music, in our hobbies, in our life, we always get feedback as we're learning. So it must be the same in the classroom. Information available on quality of learning and linked to learning intentions and success criteria. Tell the student where you want them to be and tell them how to be successful. Looks forward to the next stage of learning. And this is just the point I made this from David Spenlove's work in putting assessment for learning into practice, that assessment for learning or formative assessment is not an attack on assessment of learning. It's absolutely not. Summative assessment, they are complementary approaches and it's about getting the balance right. And it is you, the teacher, the educationalist, the facilitator, who decides the balance and timing of formative and summative assessments. And I think that's key. Sometimes we rush down the road of formative assessment and we try everything at once and we forget that, you know, we're leading to an end. And once in Ireland there's state exams, so once there's a state exam at the end of it, that's summative. It's our job to make sure they get there with lots of formative assessment. And just the last slide in this section, I leave you with these quotes from Lycett et al. From Carp Paper 2019, and there's a bibliography at the end as well. And I know this has been recorded, so you'll have access to it. I'm not giving you homework to read it, but it's there. I recommend it. Assessment as an organic activity encapsulates the idea that it is something that occurs naturally and on an ongoing basis in the classroom. And this links directly to one of the last slides today. And I'll leave that till the end, and I'll come back to this one then. It does not in any sense interrupt the process of teaching and learning. Rather, it is an invisible but real part of this process. So the use of the Padlet, the use of questioning, the use of the Mentimeter, the use of the digital tool, the use of the graphic organizer that I'll mention later on, all incredible and all part of the process, not something that you do and the student feels they're doing something different. If assessment as an entire entity is understood to be part of teaching and learning, this should empower teachers to consider when they engage with any type of assessment, how and not whether that assessment is embedded in teaching and learning. So you're not thinking, is this assessment part of it? You're thinking, how is it part of it? Do you want to ask the next question, John?
Yes, Cormac. That's why, as we see here, that formative assessment is really not a mindset, something different than the mindset. Perhaps it's more than a mindset. But my question is, can we really establish a 21st century lifelong learning and facilitating habitat without applying and generating different formative assessment approach, and why?
Thanks for that, John. So can we really establish 21st century lifelong learning and facilitating habitat without applying, generating, and different formative assessment approaches, and why? And I think throughout the next 45, 50 minutes, we're going to see the answer to that, but in particular in the next number of slides. And it's a mindset. This formative assessment mindset is something that is part of our world now. It's part of our classrooms, but it's more than that. It should be part of all the educational experience. And it's more than a tool or strategy. And that's what we're trying to get across to you today. We will give you the tools, and teachers want the tools. But this has to be more, it has to be the way that we plan our lessons. It has to be embedded in the way that we think about our lessons. It has to be embedded in the way that we want to facilitate the teaching and learning. And I use that phrase all the time, teaching and learning, because that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. It's a mindset needed by students to self-nurture and reinforce their 21st century lifelong learner skills. If I can transport you back, well, in my case, embarrassingly so, 30 years, to starting post-primary school, 40 years nearly to primary. I want to be told, we want to have this assessment going on. We want affirmation all the time. But the student is an independent learner, a self-explorer, must have a focused and confident mindset. And I won't skip to the last one yet, inspired and communicative inquirer, an innovative problem solver. And then all this is leading to a critical and positive thinker. And in my work with the university in Galway on the West Coast, my alma mater actually, where I lecture PGCE or their PME students, we call them here, you want critical thinkers and positive thinkers going out from school into university. And you want them going from university into the workforce, because a critical thinker, a self-explorer, an independent learner, anyone with this formative assessment mindset that we develop through primary and post-primary learning all the time, is equipped to follow any path, I believe, in education or in life. A critical thinker is not going to be funneled down one particular path because that's the only place their education leads them. If we develop self-explorers, inspired communicative inquirers, innovative problem solvers, they will be focused on developing and becoming critical thinkers, which will allow them to develop educationally and professionally in the life after they leave our care. So at the end of this session, after all that introductory stuff, it's hope that you will have, and this is best practice, as I said, it would be very wrong of me to talk about best practice and then not do it myself. John wouldn't be happy, and I don't want to upset John. At the end of this session, participants will have a better understanding of assessment, engage with the practice of developing effective learning intentions, but we'll talk about that because of the numbers here, engaging with it is not entirely possible, and understand the process of co-creating success criteria. We'll understand what success criteria are. And we have a video about that, and we'll skip through it. But really and truly what I want to get to as well is a key section in the middle where we talk about how we bring about formative assessment in the classroom.
So it's almost impossible, Cormac, to have a 21st century lifelong learning environment without formative assessment.
Oh, you can't. It's as I said, John, it's part of the suite of support that we provide for learners in our classrooms.
Yeah.
And it's a key part, because as students live in everyday life and as they go on to university and to professional life, this regular assessment, this regular critiquing, this regular affirmation of their learning, this regular understanding of where the student is going as part of it. So it would be remiss of us as professionals not to have it at the center of everything we're doing in the 21st century classroom.
And that's why, Cormac, my third question will be, please, if you can elaborate for us on those novel approaches needed to link the theory of formative assessment to the practical methods for learning in the classroom.
This is, as I said, this is my favorite part of the presentation. I will elaborate on them, I'll explain them. And if people have questions as we're going through it, please let me know. And one of the reasons I was really looking forward to engaging with teachers today is that some of the stuff, some of the techniques that we talk about now in my job, I experienced first teaching internationally. I have huge faith in teachers. I have huge faith in educators, because I see, even on a Saturday, coming to listen to me for an hour and a half to talk about, and prior to this, you have no idea who I am, but to trust me that you're going to listen to me for an hour and a half, well, that's part of the huge confidence I have in those who are facilitating learning. So a lot of the approaches I've used here, I've used myself, and I've learned teaching internationally, and thankfully brought them back. This is Dylan Williams. It's 2 minutes. And with best practice in teaching and learning, generally I would say ask a question of your students, give a written work paper, maybe ask them to consider some points. Just for this morning, for this, because we have another video, I'll just ask you to listen to Dylan Williams and take some of his learning from it, because he's a well-known published author on this area. John, is there sound there?
Yeah. To me, formative assessment describes all those processes by which teachers and learners use information about student achievement to make adjustments to the student's learning that improve their achievement. So it's about using the information to adapt your teaching and adapt the work of the students to put the learning back on track, if you like, to make sure that the learning is proceeding in the right direction and to support that learning. So it's what happens when you don't just lecture students and rattle through the material until you get to the end and ask them if they've understood it okay. It's constantly making those adjustments. One of the ways I like to talk about it is just imagine what would happen if a pilot flew like many teachers assess. So I flew back from Seattle a few weeks ago. Just imagine what the pilot would have done. He would have flown east for 9 hours, and then after 9 hours he'd say it's time to land. So he'll put the plane down and he'll ask, is this London? And of course, even if it's not London, he says, well, everybody's got to get off because I've got to get onto the next journey. And that's exactly the way that we've assessed in the past. We teach students material, and at the end of that teaching, we find out if they've learned it or not. And if they haven't, we say, too bad, because we're on to the next unit. So what formative assessment does is encourages teachers to take constant readings about where students are, just in the same way that a pilot takes constant readings about their position. And if the learning isn't proceeding as you'd planned, then you make adjustments. That's the essence, to me, of formative assessment. So the reason I think that formative assessment is the right focus is because assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It's only through assessment of some kind that you know whether what has been taught has been learned. And that's why I think this focus on this assessment process, minute by minute and day by day, not at the end of a sequence of learning, minute and day by day, allows teachers to reflect on their practice and make small steps in improving that practice in a more powerful way than anything we've seen before.
As I said, I'd recommend you spending time just listening to Dylan Williams, and if you can get into learn about formative assessment and talk to him or learn from him, it's a good place to start if you have any queries. Okay, so terminology that we'll use, and terminology that I mentioned in the learning intentions. The learning outcome leads to learning intentions, leads to success criteria, but it's not a one-way process, okay? And success criteria are linked to learning intentions and therefore to learning outcomes. They're developed by the teacher and or the student and describe what success looks like. I would recommend that we discuss with our students what the success criteria are. And I would also recommend that we remember the variety of needs in our classrooms. And we talk to our coordinator responsible for additional needs, and we say, how can I challenge? And always challenge. And that's another lesson I've learned in dealing with the inspectorate. Every child in our classroom must be challenged. So it's important to listen to student voice when we're coming up with success criteria and challenge all of the students to reach their potential, and describe what success looks like. And they help the teacher and student make judgments about the quality of student learning. Because if you know what you need to attain and you know how to get there, then you're more comfortable in your learning. And again, that's from an NCCA document in 2019.
Great.
And this is just from Hattie and Clark. With more people coming in, which is great. Absolutely great. Every so often I'll just ask, can you hear me? Because it's just good practice. So John, everything's okay so far?
Yes, outstanding.
Brilliant. Yeah. I'm just conscious sometimes people drop in and drop out, so I just want to make sure we don't lose anyone. If you look at the learning intention, we're learning to design a post for holiday into St. Lucia, and success criteria is remember to include a picture of the beach, a picture of the accommodation, information, persuasive language, value for money, clear letting about the destination. And B, the learning intention is we are learning to design an effective poster. So these skills in B, the success criteria, are transferable. Clear large lettering, important information, cost, dates and times, eye-catching relevant pictures, colors will stand out against the background, and a persuasive hook. So B success criteria are more transferable across. The success criteria in A are okay for designing a holiday to St. Lucia. However, B, we can design a poster for any holiday if needs be. On the poster thing, actually, and I'll reference this later on too, never forget and never dismiss the value of poster making or anything that allows all learners access to learning. One thing I learned in Italy was, these are real life examples, when we did teaching GCSE history, you know, and you're asking for the students to present and talk about their learning. It was much easier to get the students in Milan to talk about the learning than the students in Ireland. It's very difficult sometimes to get the students here to get up and talk because it's not part of their natural educational experience. But getting students to talk about their learning, to take ownership of their learning, and a poster is the same. It allows all students access to learning, and it's visual. So B is more effective here. Success criteria can be, and I know these are technical terms, and some might be sitting thinking, well, I don't quite get it. You do get it, to be honest, to reassure you. You use these every day in your educational language. You're using them in the classrooms every day. And it's just a matter of putting a phrase on what you're saying in the classroom. I'm 100% confident that everybody here, every facilitator, every educator here is using these steps in their learning. And I suppose what I'm doing in these slides is just putting a title on them that you know and maybe reinforcing already your knowledge. It's a series of steps, a sequence of instructions, a visual aid memoir, a list of options or menu, questions, a list of remember to prompts. It can be a timeline on a wall, it can be posters on a wall, it can be an invitation to be at a certain point of learning, all of various stages along the way that allow this to become a whole part of an educational experience. And this brings us to this video. Do you want to come in, John, there?
Yes, excellent answer. Thank you very much, Cormac. My next question is, facilitators, of course, alias teachers, because as we said, we're facilitators now. We don't teach anymore. We facilitate the inquiry and acquisition of knowledge and skills to our students, face many challenges. And based on my 34 years of experience, always when I was a teacher and when I was a principal, all my teachers came to me, okay, you're asking us, John, to do this with facing many challenges when establishing formative assessment techniques and approaches. Because when we want to create within our differentiated classroom, central classroom without borders, what are, the main question is here, what are the strategies that must follow to ensure that those challenges and those constraints are 100% eliminated, and establishing a formative assessment environment habitat, it's much easier.
Thanks for that, John. And that leads us nicely into the next section. And with this video, and again, in following best practice, what I'd ask is that for my benefit, for John's benefit, and for the benefit of all the facilitators and educationists here, just have a look at the video and take out a bit the strategies that are mentioned, because this will allow us to elaborate on those strategies over the next number of slides. And hopefully at the end of this section, you'll have a very good idea of the strategies that you can follow to ensure that the 21st century lifelong learner accesses learning within your classroom or within the classrooms in the learning environment in your school.
Formative assessments. Why should you use formative assessments in your practice? As a teacher, it is your responsibility to find out if your students do not understand what is being taught. Students are going to have misconceptions. Students will become lost at times. Poor teachers continue to teach whether or not their students understand. However, teachers need to know if their students don't understand what's being taught. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with a class full of confused students that haven't learned anything. So master teachers use formative assessments to make decisions to reteach or move forward. So use formative assessments to change a teaching method, to assign extra homework, or even move forward onto the next topic. When should you use formative assessments? Well, it should be used continuously throughout the lesson. It should be integrated with your instruction to the point where you teach, then assess, teach, then assess, teach, assess, etc., and so forth. So make it comfortable for your students to respond to questions. Formative assessment should take place firmly during the teaching process. Here are some examples. First up, hand signal 1 to 5. 1 to 5.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
1 to 5 is a whole class assessment. So a teacher may be working a problem on the board, let's say. At some point, that teacher will want to stop. Then they will formatively assess their students by having them rate their understanding on a scale from 1 to 5, using their fingers. 1 finger is the lowest level of understanding. Students will put up 1 finger if they are absolutely lost. 2 fingers indicate the student has a vague understanding. 3 fingers indicate the student is in the middle. 4 fingers means the student has a good understanding. And 5 fingers is the highest level of understanding. 5 fingers means the student has mastery.
I think every time someone comes in,
Yeah. Okay.
okay.
Student has a good understanding. And 5 fingers is the highest level of understanding. 5 fingers means the student has mastery. Ultimately, 1 to 5 is the quickest way to assess a large group of students. Number 2, brainstorming. Brainstorming usually takes place before introducing a new topic. Teachers use brainstorming to get an idea of what their students already know about a topic. Ask some examples of predator-prey relationships. Then list the examples on the board. The good part is students will also learn examples of predator and prey as you brainstorm. Brainstorming is a great assessment for gauging a class's prior knowledge on a topic. Third, exit tickets. Used mainly at the end of a lesson, hence the word exit. The teacher will ask an essential question, a question that revolves around a big concept of the lesson. Formative assessments are always meant to be quick. Give students about 2 or 3 minutes only. Students are given a small slip of paper. The question is answered on the slip of paper. You can use exit tickets to track implementation of standards throughout the course. Exit tickets are best used for assessing a lesson's overall objective or goal. Fourth, think, pair, share. A 3-part assessment. Step 1 is think. The first thing you do is assign your class a question to think about and work on. Be sure to give students appropriate wait time for the question. Step 2 is pair. Pair your students with a classmate. It's probably best that the teacher chooses the partners. Working together, this assignment helps to promote 21st century life skills, and don't forget to allow students to compare their thoughts and answers. Last part, share. Now your student is called upon to share their thoughts on the question with the rest of the classroom. The teacher will make corrections on the student's responses for all to hear. This assessment is also an excellent classroom activity. Now our last example, individual whiteboards. To perform this assessment, teachers must provide each student with an individual whiteboard. Distribute an individual whiteboard to each student. Then ask the student questions such as, what is the square root of 144? The student will respond by writing their response to the question on the whiteboard using a dry erase marker. Now the teacher will individually assess each student's response, and more importantly, the teacher can give appropriate corrections to any mistakes made. The student can both see the mistake and learn from the mistake.
I might stop it there. And the reason I just want to jump in on the whiteboard, if that's possible. Of course, anyone that uses MS or Microsoft will know that there's a whiteboard on that platform that can be used. You can use Jamboard if you want. There's a slide later on that we talk about not forgetting the skills that we learned over the last 2 years in the pandemic. I went into a school down the west of Ireland recently to support them, and the teachers had been using Microsoft Teams and SharePoint throughout the 2 years, and all of a sudden then it's nearly obsolete now because everyone's back in the classrooms. Whereas if you're a meter apart in a pandemic classroom, as you have to be here, at the back, you can still do group work on shared documents. You can still do group work on the Jamboard. You can still do group work on the whiteboard. The idea of holding up a whiteboard as well, if everyone's looking in the one direction, means that your answer should be relatively safe in yours, and it's a very quick way of formative assessment, a very quick way of giving feedback. But I asked you to take whatever you could out of that video. As I said, it's best practice in a teaching and learning environment to give an assignment, because I know when I was in school, I probably would have sat at the back and drifted off after a minute or two. But if I have something that I have to find in the video, then I pay attention. He mentioned think, pair, share, which we've mentioned already. Give time to think. Especially in questions as well, give time to answer. The essential question, we'll get to in a moment, is a great way of framing a series of lessons or an inquiry-based learning activity. 1 to 5 is very good. Different ways of 5 things you know today, 3 things you do, 3 things you've learned, 2 things you're not sure of. Brainstorming, I know it sounds very simple, but we did it at the start. We used Mentimeter. It's exactly the same thing. You can use Mentimeter to brainstorm. You can just do brainstorming on the board. And the exit tickets, or a 2-minute thesis, or stop and jot, where they write down in bullet points everything they've learned and one thing they want to learn. And it's sometimes good for us as well as teachers, because maybe the bit of the lesson, the bit of the learning experience that we as facilitators thought was the best bit, the students may not have got it all. And it's important that we're well aware of what's going on in the classroom. But feedback is among the most powerful moderators of learning. The best feedback is highly specific, directly, highly descriptive, directly revealing or highly descriptive of what actually resulted, clear to the performer, and available or offered in terms of specific targets and standards. Again, it's the clarity that students need. Feedback must be linked to the learning intention and success criteria, as well as moving the learning forward. Otherwise, it tends to become either a judgment or advice. And that sounds complicated, but as I said, I would be 100% confident that that's what you're doing in your schools or in your classroom environments or your learning environments anyway, that the feedback is linked to the learning, but it also pushes the learning forward. So we're not always passing judgment on what's gone on before, but we're framing the learning going into the future. It's ongoing. It only works formatively if the student has the opportunity to improve to better achieve the learning outcome. In summative assessment, the feedback is too late. Make use of a variety of techniques to allow all learners to access the learning experience. Now, I'm going to go into a series of techniques here. You know your audience, you know your students, you know your classroom. You don't have to take every technique that I give you today or that you hear about and go in. What I always say to teachers I support in the workshops I do is, if we can take one or two methodologies from summer to Christmas, one or two from Christmas to the following summer, and perfect them with an older group and a younger group, and we do that over a natural cycle of a school of 4 to 6 years at the higher levels, age-wise, you'll develop 16 to 24 methodologies, and that's a whole amount of methodologies to have in your back pocket when you're in a classroom trying to meet the needs of all these learners. So I think that's more important, of this long-term helicopter reflective view on what you want to do, rather than rushing to get all these things in at once. So a traditional classroom, I'll let you read the traditional classroom one, as you know all this.
Lot of questions, Cormac, and at the end we're going to answer them all by God's will.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I invite questions, and I invite you that as well, maybe that you share your ideas, especially on the Padlet if you can access it. If not, we put it in the chat, and myself and John can put it in the Padlet. It's a great way of continuing this collaborative environment that we're trying to create. And that's what I said at the start, you know, that it is very wrong of me professionally to talk to you here for an hour and a half and then everything disappears into the ether. It's more, I'd be much happier if out of this we created this collaborative learning environment. And I know from talking to John that that's what he values greatly.
Yes.
And in the differentiated classroom, differences are studied as a basis for learning. Assessment is ongoing and diagnostic. There's a focus on multiple forms of intelligences. Student readiness, interest, and learning profiles shape instruction. So we develop our lessons, our learning environment on the needs of the student, not on the needs of a text. Many instructional arrangements are used and multiple materials are provided. And I think multiple materials is better than single text. I'm not saying don't use the text. I'm just saying don't rely on the text totally, because to put it, and you never measure anyone's intelligence on reading age, I know that. But if I'm starting school at 13 and the reading age of the text is 15 and I have learning difficulties that say my reading age is less than that, well, then I'm struggling straight away. Whereas if I come in and I experience learning through a variety of lenses, well, then I'm a winner straight away. And as I said, this is a direct answer to John's question about techniques and approaches. So the next few slides. So how to introduce it in your classrooms. Feedback, we've mentioned that. We spent time on that. Digital tools, you've already experienced 2 in this lesson. Essential questions we'll get to in a moment. Anyone that's teaching the IB here will know all about essential questions. Anyone who's in the American system will know all about essential questions. 1-minute thesis, stop and jot. Take time, write down what you know, what you don't know. How can I help you? I once had a boss in school and his policy was to ask every teacher and every student, you know, at least once when he met them, how can I help you? What can I do for you? Because if you ask it often enough, you'll eventually get to the end where you have everyone looked after. Journals, journaling, and journals need not necessarily be paper and pen. Digital portfolios, the use of folders, SharePoint and MS, as I said, Google Classroom, collaborative online environments, whatever you can use to share virtually is the same as journaling if it wants to take time to write down their thoughts. It's another great way of assessment is putting together portfolios for learning, because at the end of each learning experience, so it might not be at the end of each lesson, but at the end of each series of lessons, your students might put together a document, either a written document, because that's probably what the likes of me would prefer when I was in school, but now I would rather put together a resource, a case study, an image, a video, and that's journaling. And that all adds to a portfolio which you can use for summative assessment, even though you've been using formative assessment the whole way through. And reflection time, very important. Hard to get time in the classroom, hard to get time for teachers. I would never tell teachers you need more time, because you just don't have time. I understand that. And then think, pair, share, which ironically is about taking that time. Okay, so we'll break it. Do you want to come in, John?
Well, outstanding. I'll go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks. We'll break each of those down. So feedback strategy. And as I said, I'm not here lecturing people on stuff that you don't know. This is stuff that you know, and I hope you feel reinforced, and I hope you feel invigorated about it and realize that this is stuff that you're doing, and you feel affirmed, because oral feedback and the student write it down. 3 questions for the student. Have you 3 questions for me? Spot your own mistake is a good one. In primary school, we used to be handed back reams of paper with red pen all over it. And you know, that if you're constantly getting corrected and you associate that red pen or that mark with not achieving standards, it can be very bad for your well-being. And we should be conscious throughout all of our learning. Well-being shouldn't be something that we talk about once a day. It should be entwined throughout all of our teaching and learning, for teachers as well. So spot your own mistake can be sometimes, look, this paragraph here, can you please spot your own mistake? Dot, in other words, you just put a dot where on beside the paragraph where you think there might be a mistake, and that's feedback in itself. Highlight the positives, always highlight the positives, and there will be many positives. And every time a student improves on something, that's a positive. It may not be as perfect as we wanted, but it's a positive. Match comments and feedback to the work. As I said, the generic comment of very good, excellent, no, related to the work, always related, and give an example from their work. And numbers linked with questions and feedback. You know, you can link the numbers and the questions and the feedback together. And they're all very basic strategies, but they're important. The greatest motivation and benefits will come from focusing feedback on the qualities of the child's work, not in comparison with other children. And I suppose I'm a bit sensitive about, since I work a lot in team teaching for inclusion in my own job, and including children with additional needs, that I'm very conscious that we look at the child's own work and where they are, and that we're constantly improving their standards of work in relation to where they've been before, not in relation to their peers. But remember, I said earlier, we challenge all students. So those students that are at the top pushing for the highest marks must be challenged, and those students who are struggling must be challenged also. Specific ways in which a child's work could be improved. So if I ask for feedback here, I'd like specific feedback. Improvements that the child has made compared to his or her earlier work. And again, that's from Hattie and Clark. And again, I would suggest that the majority of people here are doing that every day anyway. Questioning. Plan the questions. I often give the example, you know, of the lollipop sticks, and I'm sure some of you have used that, where you put the names of your students on the lollipop sticks and they're in a jar and they're picked out randomly for questions. And I'll be honest, when that came first, I would have been dismissive of it. I would have said, no, I can phrase the questions myself. But the teacher next door to me taught German, and of course I teach history and politics, and she used the lollipop sticks. And the older students, the A-level standard Leaving Cert students in Ireland, I had, and I was 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and they asked, could they use the lollipop sticks? They asked, they requested it. Why do you not use them, sir? And Ziga next door uses them. And I suppose the lesson in that for me was that students are central to learning and they need to be part of it. And that method of just random questioning is very fair. Ask questions in ways that include everyone. Give time. There's a great TEDx where one of the speakers says one thing he learned from dealing internationally with people is time. It's important to take time after you speak and to speak to people and not at people. Give students time to think. Avoid judging students' responses. Avoid the facial expression. Avoid rushing to the next student quickly to get an answer. Engage in conversation. But follow up students' responses in ways that encourage deeper learning and deeper thinking. Simple things like, and how did you come to that conclusion? And what's the research behind that? Because straight away you're triggering that you can't just come up with an answer, you need to have a reason. And this brings us to essential questions. And I'll be honest, I'm biased here. I love essential questions. In my politics class, we use essential questions all the time. And they're a great way of framing a series of lessons or a learning experience. And then in a cross-curricular learning outcome-based teaching and learning experience, essential questions are a brilliant way of getting across all aspects of learning. It allows you to engage in a series of rich inquiry tasks to explore various elements required to frame and answer the question. Of course, rich inquiry tasks sounds, have we a hand raised, John?
Yeah, we can, they can ask question now if they want to.
If they
Siddhartha,
want,
go
yeah.
ahead, please. Siddhartha, you have a question? Go ahead,
Okay,
please. Yes.
I have a question in terms of what was already mentioned by Ada, like in a class, like for example, as you say that there should be strategies for gifted students as well as different levels of students. I agree. As a visual art teacher, the nature of my subject is already differentiated, where a student which has a very strong observation skills as well as a student who has less observation skills, as well as the critical thinking is limited. So when, as you said, the lessons or the instructions or the worksheets should be differentiated in according to the level of the students. Not many times, but I have faced recently from one parent, like they think that giving my student a different instruction sheet or a different homework sheets, that means why they are unable to accept that my kid is not that gifted, you want to say, compared to the other ones what you have in class.
Yeah,
So
I think I understand what you're asking, because I did the same thing. I had in a history class, I had a student that was struggling, and I thought that by lowering expectations, and I know that's not what you're doing, you're giving a different worksheet, and our perception as educators is that we're doing the right thing, but the parent then asks the question, why is my student getting a different worksheet? And I think the answer lies in you and the student. You know the student's ability, so you yourself, when you're planning, must have agreed. If it was a department, you would have the meeting and you would say, well, look, Cormac's in my lesson, he's struggling in art, these are my expectations for him in terms of learning. Now you can't have that discussion with the student, and the parent probably doesn't want to hear that either, but it means that if you give the same worksheet, the student still feels part of it, but your expectations of achievement for that student are in line with, they're not lowered, they're in line with that student's potential learning. And that means that the student is not getting, and I hope I'm understanding the question right, that means that the student is not getting a different worksheet, they're getting the same worksheet, but what is achievable for that student, you know, and you can then give your feedback on that learning, as opposed to comparing that student's learning, as I mentioned in the previous slide, to all of their peers' learning. You are only comparing that student's learning to previous learning. So if the student improves on that worksheet, on the previous worksheet, then you know as a teacher that that student is making progress, and the parent is not seeing that their child is getting a different worksheet. Does that answer the question?
Good. Yeah, because at the end of the day, what happens, all the parents, because I teach the senior school, grade 10, 11, 12, for the IGCSE and IB visual arts.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, and here the criteria for where IB or IGCSE, say in art, there is no differentiated criteria.
Mm-hmm.
So whether for the gifted student and not gifted student, the assessment criteria is the same. So I have to judge a student according to what the criteria has been set by IBO on this thing. And every parent's dream is to get his kid or his or her kid to the best college.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So then it becomes a very challenging for a teacher when you give a differentiated worksheet to, because the student understand I am not good in drawing compared to the X. Okay, so the X is getting a different worksheet and I am getting a different worksheet because I need to improve my drawing skills. But at the same time, the parents' concern is why my child is getting this thing, why my child is not getting an A like X.
Yeah, no, that's the reality, and that's the problem with summative assessment. That's the problem with the IB or the A level, and I'm a big fan of both. And even the Leaving Certificate here in Ireland, I would change it if I could totally, because summative assessment means that parents, and rightly so, you can understand 100% where the parents coming from, and teachers are under serious pressure to get those results. And that's why summative assessment has taken over education over the last number of years. And thankfully now, formative assessment, what we're talking about today, becomes better for learning. In terms of a differentiated worksheet, the same worksheet goes out, but the expectations for you as a teacher, maybe it's a conversation that has to be had with the parent or with the principal, but then see, those people in the school still expect high results. So the answer is what I said to you earlier on. It's important that we engage in formative assessment, that we talk about the learning as we go through the process, and that the parent realizes that the students' levels are where they are, but by doing it your way, you will improve those levels. But I fully appreciate where you're coming from. I mean, I see it in my job. I could do 2 hours of a workshop about teaching and learning, and then someone will just ask, can I have a template, please? Can I have an essay sample, please? Because there's pressure for that summative assessment. So no, I agree, and I hope the answer that I gave, that, you know, the idea that anyway, I would suggest that worksheets, even exam questions are differentiated. I mean, there's no coincidence that I always use maths as the example, that the first A, B, and C in a maths question are easier than D, E, and F. So maths questions are differentiated long before we thought it was cool to talk about differentiation. I don't have the solution, but I can, to your query, but that's the answer, that rather than giving a worksheet to a parent, or going home to a parent, they're thinking, why am I getting this and other students are at that, a differentiated worksheet, and knowing the level the student is at, so that all the feedback we give is related to that student's previous work, not in relation to their colleagues. That's just the way it has to be. But it's a mindset change, and that's what John mentioned earlier on. The 21st century classroom with formative assessment is a mindset change. It's using formative assessment to constantly critique and improve learning throughout the process. Unfortunately, as you said, we meet a stumbling block when some people, and understandably so, because parents are vested deeply in their child's education, and rightly so. We have to applaud that. I mean, that's brilliant. That they're engaged in summative assessment. John, there's other hands been raised. Do you want to move on? And we come back
move on, and then we'll come back to the questions. Yes.
Yes. Anyway, essential question allows the teacher to engage in a series of rich inquiry tasks to explore various elements required to frame an answer to that question. So a rich inquiry task is how we engage in the learning. It's the activity that you're using. You might use a video like we did as a hook, as a stimulus to engage the student. You might use a case study to add more information. You might use a written exercise to allow them to explore what they engage with in the case study. But for example, what we've used here might be the question, oh, sorry, there's a typo on that screen. And I don't want anyone to answer this, but what does it mean to be Irish? I would be worried with what you would come back with. And that's the initial discussion at the start of a learning process, which might be 2 lessons, 3 lessons. And over the stage of the next number of lessons, then we look at data and evidence to investigate using a methodology. We explore key thinkers, we explore theorists, we explore ideas. It might be artists if we're talking about art. Examples or case studies of what it means to be Irish is explored. We create understandings, and that's important, not to maybe hand out definitions, but create understandings collaboratively. So the groups of students would work together to generate understandings of key terms rather than just throwing out. And the reason is that, you can always have a slide with the key term definitions and show it to the students after they've engaged trying to generate understandings, because the understandings they generate, they will remember. And at the end of the exercise, you say, well, look, we've taken everything in your understandings and these are the definitions and you're very close to it. And it's probably a better way of doing it, and a visual stimulus or a hook. And so you all through the learning process, you refer back to the essential question. So after looking at the relevant documentation, what now do you think does it mean to be Irish? After looking at the case studies, can we go back to the essential question? Have you changed your opinion on it? And each task allows students to engage with elements of course, curriculum, subject, and use their conclusions to provide an answer or informed opinion. The essential question then becomes part of the summative assessment. So the essential question you phrase at the start can become part of the essay or the assignment or the portfolio or the question that you ask for as part of summative assessment. Interactive tools, graphic organizers, video. Edpuzzle is very good for editing videos. I'm sure many have used it. If you haven't, it's worth looking at. You put in the YouTube clip for the video and you can edit it to bring you where you want to be on it. Duolingo, as someone who has struggled to learn language, I'm very embarrassed actually to be in such company of people who speak so many languages, and to hear John chatting away in English and then in French, which I know are only two of his many languages. It's embarrassing coming from where I am, but Duolingo has been my savior at times, and it is for students. QR coding, slides, PowerPoint. Invite a personality to dinner, and that's particularly relevant to humanities subjects, because you can, it's relevant to all subjects, but we use it in our history and in our politics classrooms, in that I might use the topic, what does it mean to be Irish, or what does it mean to be a nation? Looking at Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities idea, and you might invite, in inverted commas, Karl Marx, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Paulo Freire. And you ask your students to engage with the question through the thought process of the personality. So you obviously have to have prior learning done on the personality, and they come and they talk about it in their groups, and each one will engage with the conversation. And you can do that, and you can have 3 Karl Marxes and 3 Thomas Hobbes in your classroom, all at different groups engaging with that. It's something that really works for exploring new topics. A walking debate, difficult if you have to be separated in COVID classrooms. I know that's changing now in many countries. You phrase the question, you put agree, disagree, strongly disagree in the corner. The students stand in that space where they agree. They can stand between them if they're not sure. They can stand in the middle, and you facilitate the discussion then, where students move as the discussion hints at them changing their mind. And of course, students being students, initially they stand where their friends are, but as it becomes part of your practice, it becomes better. You can do it on Jamboard very easily, using the sticker element on Jamboard, on Google Jamboard. You can do it outside in the yard if needs be as well. Traffic lights, red I don't understand, amber I'm not sure, green yeah I'm okay. And polling is like Mentimeter, but you use whiteboards for polling. You can simply use hands up for polling, as the video suggested. Very important, because all the time you're getting student feedback and student understanding of their learning. I would stress this already. Over the past 2 years, educators have embraced, encountered, and experienced a myriad of new classroom skills. I don't think, be careful what I say here now, I don't think that educators, you who have so wonderfully come to join me this morning, I don't think you have got the credit that you deserve for the education that you have continued to provide in incredibly difficult circumstances over the last 2 years. What educators have done all over the world globally has been amazing. We've added, as educators, to our understanding of pedagogy and effective classroom practice. We've added a whole raft of new skills. Online teaching, Google Jamboard, MS Whiteboard, breakout rooms, and I'm sure at this stage you're sick of breakout rooms. And that's why I said to John, will I use breakout rooms? And his advice was solid. He said, well, maybe not, because we've had breakout rooms for 24 months. Mentimeter, shared documents, shared spaces, videos of learning. I'll come back to that. Flipped classroom, team teaching, oral feedback, use of learned IT skills, all of the stuff that you put into your backpack of resources shouldn't diminish. Our students live in an instant society. I mean, I often used to ask them when they turn on their TV, how many of them keep pushing the button? When they go to the elevator, how many of them keep pushing the button? There's an instant society, and it's imperative that we match their expectations. The home economics example or domestic science, with a change in structure in senior cycle in Ireland at the moment, there's a move to hour-long lessons. And the home economics departments are struggling with that in a way because the prior preparation of food is a key part of their exam. So the preparation of onion or carrot or whatever before they go into the cooking part is incredibly important part of their exam. So a school I worked with recently had taken videos of all the learning, taken videos of the early prep, and have put in a shared space. So that's there for all eternity now, so students can access it at any stage. And these are all things that we've done in the last 2 years, and maybe we should be emphasizing that as part of formative assessment in the classroom. All of these things are incredibly important. I'm keen not to promote just one or two, and I know in some parts of the world it's harder to access these than others, but MS Forms, Google Forms, recorded verbal feedback is possible, and on those use of shared documents, slides for feedback, formative assessment, exit strategies that were mentioned earlier on, use of forms for immediate exit strategies and feedback on learning. Mentimeter can be used for an exit strategy. It can be 3 things you learned today. They type it in, it comes up on the board. All of a sudden you have a word cloud that you can save. Jamboard, Whiteboard, SharePoint, shared spaces to keep digital portfolios I mentioned earlier on. Now, if I'm going too fast, let me know. But I think it's important that we remember that this space that we can share all this information is a part of formative assessment. And remember, the students are computer literate, they're IT literate, many of them. It doesn't mean that we should concentrate solely on that aspect of learning, but it should certainly remain part of our learning. And I promised you strategies. So exit strategies are key part of formative assessment. There are student analysis of own learning. So as well as that, it eases your burden as a teacher, and it generates communication. All of a sudden, you're talking about learners. We often ask a question in my work to workshops: when did you really feel heard in your educational life? And I have to say, with the exception of 2 teachers who spring to mind immediately, I didn't feel heard until I went to university. So stop and jot, literally get the students to stop for 2 minutes and jot down. 5 points is like the 5 fingers. Emojis, it's okay to use emojis, you know. If you print them out once, they're there forever. Happy face, sad face, confused face. Especially with the junior students, I find they get great fun and laughing at that, but you get to learn what they know. 2 good things, 2 bad things. Journal use I've mentioned already. What could I do better? It's fairly straightforward. A visual scale on the wall. I saw that in a classroom last year. There's a scale of 1 to 10 with a cord, and they could slide up and down on the scale where they were in terms of their learning. Use of Socrative, which of course is a digital tool. Use of forms, Microsoft Forms or Google Forms. Kahoot is another one. Pear Deck, Flipgrid, and Go Formative. And this is recorded, and I know John has a slide deck and he can share it, I'm sure, afterwards, on all those things. So rather than sitting there taking notes and walking through each of them, they're definitely worth exploring. And I meant what I said earlier on. Take time to explore them, pick 1 or 2 and we'll go with them. You can always come back and get the rest of them. In summary, strategies for you to use. And I want to break out of the slide deck in a minute, and I'll show you a book, and I'll share it and Padlet for you, or in the chat for you. Posters, I mentioned them earlier on. In one of the state exams in Ireland, you used to get 6 marks for doing a poster. You only got 3 marks if you didn't color it in and put the right information. So posters are incredibly important, and I don't say that lightly. If you have them up in your classroom wall, like in my school, you might have them up when you're doing dictatorship and democracy in Europe, which is part of our course. Make sure there are different posters up there when you're doing the next section, and get the students to relay their ideas visually. Drama, create crosswords, QR coding we've used already today. Socrative I've mentioned, Fakebook, Duolingo I've mentioned. The use of podcasts in the classroom. It doesn't have to be a whole podcast. if possible in school, could you create them? You could actually. I mean, you record a Zoom call, you can create a webinar. Students can do that. Class blog, mind maps, PowerPoint, which we take for granted because we use every day. But do students know how to create a PowerPoint? Could they create a 6-slide PowerPoint? And the first slide and the thank you slide don't count as those 6. It's very important to get across to your students. Graphic organizers, Edpuzzle I've mentioned. On the graphic organizers, I like big circles, all right? Some people like lines, some people like the fishbone. I would suggest, just from working with schools over the last 4 years and working with the PME students or the university students, vary the graphic organizer you use. Ultimately, you're looking for the same thing, that they can garner information. But we think differently and different things appeal to us. So it's important to even differentiate the organizer you use. Survey questionnaires, we have an evaluation at the end. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of asking students their opinion. Role play, as I said, drama, Twitter feeds. You can even use a great strategy I learned from a teacher, and actually a more experienced teacher, which is interesting. You're only allowed a certain number of characters writing a Twitter feed. It's a great way of getting students to edit their thoughts. Really good way. And you can get a graphic of a Twitter space and they can only use a certain number of characters. Watch a YouTube video. Use Edpuzzle to edit a YouTube video down to what you want. Adopt the board game. Create a video diary. Make a model. Interview and Kahoot. And a lot of these, as I said, are discursive and dialogic. They allow students to interact with the teachers. But, and John and myself laughed when I put this in, we must ensure that formative assessment does not become a set of teaching tips that ultimately fall into unthinking routines of traffic lights, 2-stars, whiteboards, success criteria, and so on. It must be part of our overall strategy. So that's what I'm saying to you, don't just run with everything. Take 1 or 2, become experts in it, in your department. And I'm very conscious because in my subject department in politics, I'm a 1-teacher department, whereas in history, there's 8 of us. So in your department, practice many of them. Maybe one of your department can practice one methodology and teach everyone else about it in your department, and so on. And that's how we spread the learning, and that's how we become owners of our. And that's actually formative assessment and collaborative learning on a school-wide basis in the staff. But yeah, it's not to become a set of teaching tips. It's to be part of our work. And just the last bit in this section then, and this is why I ask you to collaborate. The most valuable resource that all educators have is each other. We're in this together. Without collaboration, our growth is limited to our own perspectives. We're in an echo chamber. It's important to get out of that echo chamber. So it's important to engage with each other, all right, and talk to each other and learn from each other. And that brings us to this. John?
Thank you very much. I'm sure that after all those explanations for the last 35, 40 minutes, a lot of educators and facilitators will already find the pathway to remove all those challenges of formative assessment challenges, if there are any. I'm sure that all of them got it, and it will help. It was very, very helpful. Thank you very much. Now, how does the implementation of formative assessment, Cormac, approaches helps and reinforce, as we saw already, the nurturing of 21st century lifelong learner traits within our future leaders that are today's students?
I think as part, John, as part of that whole suite of what we provide as educators, as facilitators, that formative assessment allows the 21st century lifelong learner trait to exist within future leaders. And those future leaders sit in front of us. I always say, in both positive and negative, the challenges that a student comes to school with at 5, 6, 7, they still have when they walk out the door at the end. And the potential that they have, it's our job to allow those students reach their potential, or at least provide them with the facilities to reach their potential and those traits. So students must be ready to challenge the social and economic transformation of contemporary knowledge, skills, competency-based societies. We've already mentioned our goal of creating critical thinkers, informed, educated thinkers that can go out into the world and become our future leaders. And it's unusual to say, but some of us might be standing in front of the future leader of our country in a classroom? We just don't know. All right. And if someone doesn't reach the leader of the classroom, they'll certainly be the leader of a business or leader of a family, which is as valuable, if not more valuable. So through peer assessment, self-assessment, scaffolding mechanism, and that's back, I think that's back to the question we had about the art, you know, scaffolding the learning for the student. Project-based assessment portfolio, I mentioned that earlier on, that portfolios are great. In the professional world, portfolios are common. In the educational world, they're less common, and we need to make them part of our learning, because as they keep contributing to that portfolio over a series of learning experiences, then it becomes part of the norm. Collaborative planning. We wouldn't go into a school, if John was my principal, I wouldn't go into a school and we're working on my own. We'd be planning together. We have to be planning together. Students the same. Real life-based assessment, bringing the students out of the classroom, bringing them out into the environment in which they can learn most. Bring them to museums, use school tours. I was reading about a school this morning, actually, in preparation for this, who are using VR, virtual reality. Actually, my previous school in Milan is using virtual reality to bring students outside the classroom while still within the classroom. And Classrooms Without Borders, and John and I have spoken of this at length. And, you know, I brought students to tours to Paris and all over Europe. I brought them to museums here, to places, the Houses of Parliament here and in Northern Ireland and Belfast. I think it's important to get outside the classroom. And as well as that, you go to a museum and students, or you go to anything that's outside the classroom, an education experience, and students absorb the learning. They nearly can't help themselves, as my father used to say to me. You can't help yourself learning because you're just standing there and it's all around you. And it's brilliant. But I would suggest this as well, as I said with the videos earlier on, that if we are bringing students outside the classroom, to that classroom without borders, make sure that they know that there's something that they need to grasp from it, that it becomes a concrete learning experience. Nothing worse as a teacher than having a great debate in a classroom and all the students leave as the bell rings, and then you realize, oh God, do they realize it was a great learning experience? Or bringing students, as I once did, to the Louvre in Paris, and bringing them up to see the Mona Lisa, and then they disappear rapidly. And I this is true. I shouldn't be saying this. And I want to wander around and look at the Egyptian exhibits and see it. And they all disappear down to buy music downstairs when the Virgin Megastore was down there, or HMV was down there. And I'm disgusted by it. But as students, they remember seeing the Mona Lisa, which is incredible for a student. So Classrooms Without Borders is incredibly important. And that is how we reinforce that learning, to answer your question, John. And I think it's an incredibly important part of learning. Education is expected to develop abilities. And I was reading the slide, you know, last week, and I was thinking, individuals' abilities. It's meant to develop our abilities to deal with problems and complex demands, mobilizing psychosocial resources, knowledge, skills, and attitudes previously acquired in learning situations similar to the context. So we can keep applying those skills, which they will come across in their daily professional or academic lives. We are preparing those learners for what's next. We're not just preparing students for that summative exam. Now, I do acknowledge the pressure that teachers are under. Of course I do. And I acknowledge that there's an exam at the end of it, but we're preparing for beyond that. And that part of that, as we mentioned already in the previous slide, is Classroom Without Borders, formative assessment, real life-based education, one subject called knowledge at the center of everything. And I say that rather than top down, but at the center of everything, facilitating and not teaching, multi-layered curriculum. Like, it's wonderful to meet all of you online. It would be so much better if we were in a big room together having this conversation, and facilitating a learning experience where we can share everything. 7 transversal skills of problem solving, which we take as the norm as adults, but it's not always that obvious. Risk assessment, initiative, decision taking, constructive management of feelings, critical thinking, and creativity. And there's that critical thinking and looking for students to be creative. And standardized tests and summative tests, they're part of our educational world, but we hope that education goes beyond that. And the key competencies, and you can see them on the slide there: social and civic, communication in mother tongue, communication in foreign languages. As I said already, I am in awe of all of you for your linguistic ability. I really am. But I suppose as John said to me recently, I can solve that by actually studying. So I shouldn't complain too much about my inadequacies. Mathematical competence and basic competencies in science and technology, digital competence, which we've alluded to all through this, but that's just practice. Cultural awareness and expression, so important. So important. As an Irishman who went to China on my own to experience walking through Pudong Airport, flying to Yantai and Shandong, to be culturally aware, to learn, to be at home in other cultures, and to be aware of your own culture is so important. So, and my PhD that I'm engaged in research for and enjoying it immensely is about creating an environment where teachers feel comfortable to talk about controversial issues or issues that are in the media at the moment, and that students might in Ireland especially, we have a classroom environment, thank God, now are multicultural, because when I was in school it was really monocultural. So now to have that cultural awareness and expression is brilliant, but are teachers equipped for that? I think internationally you are, but maybe not here. Sense of initiative and entrepreneurship, and learning to learn. And again, initiative, entrepreneurship, you're asking for skills there for beyond the summative assessment. I think
that's why I think we can state bluntly today that Cormac, formative assessment approaches are considered one of the central pedagogical pillars to reach the apex of horizontal integration, which is the one subject called knowledge. I think we agree with that, and you're explaining this why it's formative assessment is one of the most supportive pillars to reach one subject called knowledge.
It is, John. It is incredibly supportive of all learning, but in particular that one subject called knowledge, because, and I'm conscious, we're talking to teachers here, and we're teachers ourselves, and we're well aware of the summative assessment aspect of education. And this is not an anti-summative assessment talk at all.
Yes.
I mean, that's part of it. Yeah, that's how students get, in Ireland especially, get their points, and that's how they go to university, and that's how they get out into the world beyond that. And we fully appreciate that. And that alludes to the pressure on teachers and the pressure on parents and the pressure on students. But if we look at education, maybe as Freire did or Rancière did in Rancière and the Ignorant Schoolmaster, talking about beyond that, the knowledge. Formative assessment is key to it, because it allows students and teachers, but students in particular, to engage with their learning. They're not sitting there, it's not been thrown at them, it's not rote learning. If we don't engage in formative assessment, the alternative quite simply is rote learning, because we're not looking for the student voice. It's impossible, as the slide says, to initiate and generate common summative assessment tool for all subject summative assessments. This will take us far away from reaching the apex of horizontal integration that is crucial. And I would wholeheartedly agree with that the formative assessment tools, and more importantly, the mindset, because tools will happen, we'll develop tools. That's easy. You can reach into your school bag any day, into your knowledge base, into that file of facts of information that you have any day, to pull out a tool or a digital tool. And hopefully I've given you some today, but it's the mindset that is the appropriate and only solution to bind different subjects and create and generate one of the main pillars to reach the apex of horizontal integration, which is one subject called knowledge. And to put that in the context of a curriculum, learning outcome-based curriculum that is cross-linear, that allows us to dip in and out of various aspects of a subject rather than following one route, is part of that as well. It allows us to create that mindset that if we were sitting in London or Paris today over coffee, me and any one of you, as you may not want that, but if you did, we would talk about education and we would dip into various aspects of it, and we would take that as the norm. But when we're asking our students to deal with topics, we ask them to deal with it on one route way, and that is not the way. So formative assessment absolutely is key to getting to that area of that one subject called knowledge, which is at the center of all our learning. And everyone here today I know is interested in that, and that's why you're here. But yeah, I don't think we can underestimate the value of formative assessment.
Yes, I agree. And that's why all of educators worldwide consider formative assessment one of the pathways to reach differentiated classrooms, as we talked about it before, and you explained that without borders. Of course, I'm sure you agree with them, and why it's so important to have formative assessment to reach the apex of classroom without borders, which is essential for 21st century lifelong learning.
Well, it's because we take the ownership of the learning from the teacher, John, and we pass it to the student, and we take the ownership of the learning. And I mentioned Rancière and Freire earlier on, and the old methods that we use, and bear in mind, and I say this, and I can quote the inspectorate in Ireland on it, there are still aspects of every course that need to be learned. Dates need to be learned, theorems need to be learned, policies need to be learned. In maths, theorems have to be learned, etc. But what we do with formative assessment is we take the learning and the onus of the learning, and we share it with the students. We don't hold the knowledge, because that imbalance we create when a teacher holds the knowledge, straight away we're saying to the student, whether we mean it or not, you're dependent upon us for learning. And if we have classroom without borders, if we have satellite out of school campuses, if we have extracurricular reflective havens, if we have international virtual combined classrooms, one of my colleagues and he works with me in Imagine Online International Education as well, actually, when I was in China, we were linked across to other schools using his computer knowledge. Artificial intelligence fun area, I mentioned virtual reality already, country's identity area or room, the internship satellite learning areas, learning resource centers, the classroom models. When we take the knowledge away just from the teacher and we share it with the students, and yes, a teacher is trained and is the professional and will facilitate the learning, but if we ask the students to engage with us, and we ask them engage in that multi-layered curriculum we talked about, and you mentioned already, John, facilitating and not teaching. Pardon me for a moment.
No problem.
IT, a crucial layer in education. It is, and nor should we be slaves to IT either. Never forget the knowledge that you have yourself. And then you have servant leadership, STEAM education, which is a broadband. As a humanities teacher, I get very upset when I just hear about STEM. STEAM is much more enjoyable as far as I'm concerned, but I'm biased. Facilitating and not teaching again, but the whole thing is combined, and at the center of it all is collaboration, curriculum, and community, which we call the 3 C's. And as I said, it's about sharing the ownership of knowledge. It's about allowing students access to learning. It's about allowing students engage collaboratively, and the benefits of that on so many layers we're not even getting into today because of time. For example, student with needs can access learning in this classroom environment. The student who's at the top of the class pushing to get the best results can access learning in this environment. The teacher becomes a facilitator, so we can step back and be reflective and allow the student to take ownership of it. Anyone who's in an IB school there will know the value of the research element, the value of having that library space where the students can engage with their own learning. All of this is key, and it goes beyond the classroom. And it in a global environment, and we're learning this week about the effects of global environment. In a global world, it's so important that our students are part of that classroom without borders, that they can push beyond and experience learning outside of the book, outside of the textbook. So yeah, I think that answers your question, John.
Yes, outstanding. Thank you for this beautiful framework. So we can say today, again, that formative assessment method paved the way to a more real-life-based STEAM education, because, as we said, STEAM education is one of the pillars of all this. So can we say that formative assessment is here to help STEAM education to reach its objectives, and how?
Yeah, but STEAM education, as I said earlier on, I said at the very start, nothing we say today should be taken on its own. Everything that we do in learning, and I think maybe governments have missed it, especially here in Ireland, and I use the Irish example a lot because it's what I know best. When numeracy and literacy was rolled out to schools and in policy, and then there was the next section, and then the next section, and then the next section, and it's no one's fault, none at all. That's just the way you have to roll it out. But a point that was lost on a lot of people was the various layers, that they're all intertwined. So yeah, formative assessment absolutely paves the way to more real life based STEAM education, because by engaging in the subjects, by having that discussion, by making the classroom discursive, as I said, by using the essential question, by referring back to the learning all the time, by having a dialogic classroom, which is possible in all subjects. It's probably more common in humanities subjects, but it's possible in all subjects, especially, and it was mentioned earlier on, the IAs that you have to do. In an IA, a student is taking control of their learning. So absolutely, formative assessment allows us head towards STEAM-based, real-life-based STEAM education.
Okay, thank you very much. So as a conclusion, we're not here to, of course, attack summative assessment. On the contrary, so that we know that formative assessment is one of the effective, appropriate tools to ensure that our students are right for today, ready for tomorrow. Can we replace, this is just to your question, replace all summative approaches with formative assessment methods and techniques? Or they complement each other?
Yeah.
Or we can use summative via formative, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do. I understand. I'm going to stop sharing the screen here so you can see me. That's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I
found this probably the most interesting question, because what I like about the audience here is we're talking about we're talking really about a group of people here from a variety of situations.
Yes.
So sometimes summative assessments is dictated by a higher power. All right. So summative assessment is part of it. So can we replace all summative assessment? Not in the current climate, John. No, because I know in Ireland the state dictates what's going on. But I think formative assessment, if it's central to everything we're doing, then summative assessment becomes less pressured and less percentage of the end experience, if you know what I mean. What I would suggest is formative assessment becomes more of a role in summative assessment, that there's a hybrid model in the middle, that your summative assessment becomes not 100%, not 80%, but maybe 50%, and the formative assessment leads through it. That would be, look, if you're asking me, yeah, I'd love if some formative assessment was all. It's just not going to happen in the current climate.
It takes time. It will take time, progressively, perhaps.
Yeah. We can sow the seeds today and move on.
Yes. So, in conclusion, as a summary, what are the main pedagogical components to establish a formative assessment learning facilitating environment considered one of the main pillars of 21st century lifelong learning education, as we said today?
And it's a really good question again, and I know I've gone over time slightly, so apologies for that. For me, okay, you look at the digital tools I've given you, you take one or two, all right, and you try and get them right. But in terms of pedagogy and the components, I think you need to have an open classroom. You need to have expectations of your students and of yourself that it's going to be honest appraisal of learning as you go forward. It's not a burden of work for teachers. It becomes part of the norm. It really is, and I emphasize that. Yes, at the start, if we're going down that road, of course, there's some work that needs to be done and change. I would never tell teachers that you need more time, because you just don't have it. I know how busy teachers are. So the main pedagogical components are that honesty, that knowledge of your subject, that belief in how central the students are to their own learning. It's incredibly important that it becomes student-centered, that we go beyond the classroom with our learning, that we take it outside of learning. It doesn't have to be to the museum every week. You know, you can go online and virtually visit places. You can bring speakers in. You can bring in guest speakers. If people aren't careful here, I'll make contact with them, and I'll be asking you to talk to my classes and my teachers. This vast knowledge of learning and education that we all share, that's key, John, to establishing formative assessment. It really is. And it just becomes part of our practice. It becomes as much part of our practice as planning. I know from working abroad that sometimes schools require lots of planning, and sometimes we plan for planning's sake. Planning has to be done, but we need to formative assessment at the middle of it, so it becomes planning for the student's sake. Yes,
I agree 100%, and that's why we can conclude that formative assessment is not just a tool, is not just a strategy. Formative assessment is not just a mindset. Formative assessment is the essence needed in every educator's and student's daily learning, facilitating learning environment to nurture, as we said, and reinforce the 21st century lifelong learning traits for our future leaders, to establish the student-centered differentiated classroom without borders, to reach the very needed and crucial apex of horizontal integration, one subject rote knowledge, to generate all the pillars needed for the real life-based STEAM education, and to ensure that our students are apt for today and ready to tackle the 21st century challenges and overcome them for a better tomorrow as future leaders.
I would agree 100%, John. Yeah.
And
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Go ahead, please.
I'm going to share again.
Yeah, you want to share some resources?
I do. Yeah. I have this here again. If people want to access it, I'll put the code in a minute. To be honest, it's an evaluation. It's not really. It's for me to know what you think. But also, it's just an example of an exit strategy using a Google form. It's a practical example of what is. What I'll do is I'll go through the next few slides and I'll put this into the chat for people when we're talking about at the end we're summing up. Okay, so if you want to use the QR code then, and I'll put the address into the chat. That's the bibliography. I'm not going to go through it. You'll have that when you get the slide deck. Do you want to come in there, John? And talk about
our next webinar will be with the great internationally acclaimed STEM expert and curriculum developer, Mr. Scott A. Campbell. He's going to talk about establishing practical electrical engineering program without breaking the bank, because everyone thinks that you need a lot of financial resources for that. He will show us that it's not that very creative, innovative webinar that's going to happen on March 19. And later in April 23, we're going to have again Mr. Cormac. Based on your feedback today, he will give you more in-depth whatever you need in formative assessment in other pillars of pedagogy. And thank you very much all for attending.